Rajkumar, should we start?
I start.
I think we can start, sir.
Okay.
So
Good evening, everybody.
Just
a warm welcome to ICRIER's first seminar on COVID-19 and the economic fallout. We have with us four eminent panelists from ICRIER. Dr. Radhicka Kapoor, who works on labor markets, Dr. Anirudh Shingal, who works on trade, Dr. Ali Mehdi, who works on health policy, and Mr. Siraj Hussain, who works on agriculture. And I, Rajat Kathuria, I will talk to you about technology and the impact of COVID-19. But before I hand it over to Ali to begin the discussion, let me just make a few introductory remarks. I hope all of you are staying safe. This is a novelty for us in ICRIER. We've rarely gone over this medium, but I understand this is probably the new normal. If this pandemic survives or endures for a long time, this might become the new normal. And this is the way we will reach out. But it's also a better way to reach out in the sense that one can reach a large number of people. So a very, very warm welcome to all of you to ICRIER's webinar on COVID and the economic impact. Let me take you back to about December or November and December, when the estimates of GDP growth had begun to come in from various international and domestic institutions. And India was envisaged to grow at about 5.5, 5.8 to 6%. That was the time in, as I said, December 2019. It wasn't as good as the rate of growth that we had expected or we had had. Let me take you back years ago, about December. But suddenly, the rate of growth plummeted because of various reasons to 5.8 to 6%. A quarter later, we are looking at rates of growth of 1.5 to 2%, and that too might be an overestimate or optimistic, because those forecasts were made by the IMF when the lockdown was supposed to be for 3 weeks, and now we've had an extended lockdown. And a lot of commentators, a lot of people who follow the economy are saying that if we are able to maintain our GDP at the level of the previous fiscal, we might be sort of well off as well. So we're not looking at high rates of growth. We are definitely not even looking at 2%. We're looking at much more moderate rates of growth. And once you have moderate rates of growth, obviously, there's going to be an impact across the sectors of the economy. And today we're going to ask the experts what they expect will be the impact on different sectors of the economy. As I said, it will be on labor markets, on health, on trade, and on agriculture. And a lot of people are comparing this outbreak of this pandemic and its impact on the economy with the 2008 crisis, especially as international trade is concerned. But there is a marked difference, I think, between the fallout of the 2008 crisis and what we are seeing now. Then it was a demand shock that permeated into international trade and to the rest of the economy. This started as a huge supply shock and became a demand shock, and it has permeated into all sectors of the economy. And it engulfs the manufacturing sectors, it engulfs agriculture, and also the services sector. And we're going to touch upon all these during our discussion. And the future, of course, of the Indian economy will be determined by the kind of policy actions that we take. And often people say that India reforms when there's a crisis. And I think, and a number of people have been writing about this, that this is an opportunity to institute structural changes in the economy, because this is an opportunity that we should seize with both our hands for the future of the Indian economy, both in terms of inclusion as well as in terms of sustainability. And I'm sure the panelists will talk to you about this and their expertise as well. So without taking too much more time, and after those introductory remarks that growth has been a big victim, and if the pandemic endures, there are going to be profound impacts, not only on the economy, but I think on the politics as well. With those remarks, let me invite Ali to make his introductory 10-minute remarks on the health sector. Ali?
Yeah, thank you, Rajat. Thank you. We just share the PPT that I have. Good evening, everyone. Am I audible? Is my voice clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Yeah, great.
You can go ahead. Yeah.
So let me start out by making an observation that we have been getting data on the number of cases of COVID-19 in India and elsewhere, and the number of deaths that have been caused. But the question is, uh, and obviously at the same time, we are also talking about the impact of COVID-19 on other sectors, especially the economy and labor markets. So the question becomes, should we continue with the present siloed approach to surveillance of COVID-19? Or should we adopt a syndemic approach, as I would illustrate here in this case? So in this brief presentation, I am going to make a case for adopting a syndemic approach to the surveillance of COVID-19. So let me start out with some data on COVID-19 vis-a-vis other health issues. So, the thing is, the last data that we have on the deaths and cases from communicable diseases is from 2018. So what I've tried to do is to calculate a daily average rate of the cases and deaths in India of the top 10 communicable diseases in India in 2018 and the cases of COVID-19 in April 2020. So as we can see in this table, that COVID-19 in April 2020, we saw the daily average was 1,162 cases a day, and the daily death average was 37. The case fatality rate was again 3.2. So if you see in comparison to other top 10 communicable diseases in India, the impact of COVID-19 has been extremely significant. So this is actually a serious health problem. If we look at this table vis-a-vis other top 10 communicable diseases in India based on data that we have, latest data from 2018. But if we look at the daily average deaths in India based on the top 20 killers in India, again, based on the latest data that we have from 2017, we see that COVID-19 ranks 21st in the Indian context. So the biggest killers have been cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, and you have this list here. So again, we need to put the threat of COVID-19 into perspective. We also need to see, what are the other diseases that are, causing the health risks in the Indian context. In China, a Brookings study pointed out that even at the peak of the COVID-19 crisis in China, COVID-19 was the 49th largest killer in the country. Again, it was not among the top killers. As far as health risks in India are concerned, given the burden of disease and death in India, these were the topmost health risks in the country. Now, can either do is to go back in the slides and look at each cases separately. Look at COVID-19 as a problem health risk, and look at its surveillance separately, H1N1 and other cases. Similarly, we can look at deaths caused by different factors separately. Again, we can do the same with vis-a-vis health risks. But it has been argued that we need to, the case has been made for adopting a syndemic approach to surveillance. Now, I'm quoting here from a recent study published in The Lancet, which says that malnutrition in all its forms, including obesity, undernutrition, and other dietary risks, is the leading cause of poor health globally. And this is also the case in India. In the near future, the health effects of climate change will considerably compound these health challenges. Climate change can be considered a pandemic. Now, again, the term pandemic is used for diseases, but the authors of the study have called climate change a pandemic because of its sweeping effects on the health of humans and the natural systems we depend on. These three pandemics, now again, they are referring to obesity, undernutrition, and climate change as three pandemics. Together, they represent the global syndemic that affects most people in every country and region worldwide. They constitute a syndemic or synergy of epidemics because they co-occur in time and place, interact with each other to produce complex sequelae, and shape common underlying societal drivers. So we are not just talking about looking at different diseases or different risks separately, but also their mutual interactions, how they synergize each other and lead to an overall ecosystem of risks. If we look at this chart, normally we talk about communicable diseases separately and non-communicable or chronic diseases separately. So on the left side, you see tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, which are, some of the leading communicable diseases in the Indian context also. And again, on the right side, you see some of the leading chronic diseases, the non-communicable diseases, chronic kidney disease, COPD, diabetes, etc. Now, it has been proposed that through certain, interactions, which are there in the middle, through high BP, nutrition, etc., these health risks, intermediate, and they also enable the communicable disease to lead to certain chronic disease. So there has been a discussion about the interlinkages between communicable and non-communicable diseases also. So this is where, we need to be going actually. We need to be looking at the interactions, the synergizing of various health risks and other risks as well. So now what we are saying is, what I'm arguing is that you must have already seen news reports that especially coming from the developed world, that there is a possibility that COVID-19 might lead to enhancement in radicalization and terrorism. It might also exacerbate poverty, inequality, and hunger. Hunger it is already doing in the Indian context. Displacement, we have already seen migrant workers, trying to reach their homes. Again, we are already talking about the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that rather than looking at the economic fallout or the social or the climate fallout of COVID-19, we need to adopt a syndemic approach and try to see how these various risks interact with each other and mutually affect sustainable development in our country. So again, this is a brief approach that I want to characterize here, because our response to COVID-19, especially in India, has been very siloed as usual, and as it has been in the case of other things as well. Yeah, that's all I would like to say. Thank you very much. Rajat? Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Ali, for those introductory remarks. I think some of the panelists or the audience might come back to you with questions. But one of the things that comes out of Ali's presentation, and one of the things that we've been observing now, is the fact that, this pandemic, and not only this pandemic, but there are other, health problems, but this pandemic has brought to the fore the frailties and the weaknesses in India's public health infrastructure. And I think the pandemic is not the best time to sort of develop any health infrastructure. The elasticity of supply of hospitals or the elasticity of supply of facilities remains very, very low. You can't have doctors overnight, although there are examples of people who are in their last year of MBBS, or some students who've been asked to serve, the people, and some other facilities have been converted into quarantine facilities. But largely, the elasticity of supply of both doctors and facilities remains very, very low. And therefore, we need to, if we're going to address the next pandemic or address the next health emergency, then we have definitely got to increase the quality and the scope of our public health infrastructure. And this is not something that is new. I think this has been said for several years, but this pandemic really brings this out into the focus, into the here and now. And I hope that we are able to do that when we try and recover from the pandemic and have our sustainable development strategies. I hope health gets the sort of focused attention that we want it to get. So thank you, Ali, for those remarks and for your presentation. May I now request Mr. Siraj Hussain, who has spent a life working in agriculture, to make his introductory remarks. Siraj sir.
Thank you, everyone. I will cover my talk of about 10 minutes in 3 segments. Certain successes of the last 1 month, a few failures, and what is the outlook for agriculture? What should we expect over the next 6 to 9 months? Now, despite the lockdown, the agricultural operations fortunately continued in Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and Rajasthan, where the Rabi crop is harvested earlier than in Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, etc. In these states of Western India, the Rabi crop is harvested towards the end of February and March. By the middle of March, the crop is harvested. So in these states, despite the shortage of labor, lockdown, police atrocities, restrictions on movement, etc., the farmers somehow harvested their crops, and in most of the places, they were able to transport them safely to the place of storage. Despite untimely rains in some parts, there was not much damage to the harvested crop in these states. So this is a big success, and we know that 60%, 60 to 65% of the industrial activity was closed, but then agriculture somehow survived because there was no option for the farmers, and therefore they could harvest their crops. In Punjab and Haryana, we have seen that due to a prolonged winter, harvesting was slightly delayed, but it has caught up very well after 15th of April. And as far as procurement is concerned, in Punjab, we are matching last year's level, so which is very good. And we hope that procurement of wheat in Punjab will touch 12 to 13 million tons, which will be very good. Now, during this period, the Ministry of Agriculture announced a number of very important decisions which have been pending for a long time. For example, they said that they wanted the state governments to declare the Warehousing Development Authority registered warehouses as market yards. So these instructions were issued, but unfortunately, the states did not really take notice of that. The instructions were also issued for direct marketing, where the states, many states, did allow direct marketing, as a result of which the consumers in bigger cities have not faced any shortage of fruits, vegetables, and other food items. In fact, the supply could have been even better, but for the restrictions imposed by local collectors and police because of very poor communication by the center. In fact, the center continues to treat it as a health problem, while it is basically a socio-economic and sociological issue as much as a health issue. Now, coming to the failures, I think it was not the failure of the union government, the Ministry of Home Affairs as such. In fact, they issued very clear instructions on 29th of March and then on 3rd of April that there should be no restriction on movement of agricultural commodities, mandi operations, harvesting, etc., etc. But somehow these instructions did not percolate down to the district level. And as a result of that, many farmers in many places could not sell their crops. And on television and social media, we saw farmers destroying their crop of flowers, their crop of cabbage, their crop of grapes, and several other foods. In fact, it was very distressing to see farmers destroying their crops, while it would not have been very difficult if the government agencies and the corporates had come together, bought these fruits and vegetables and supplied them to NGOs or other organizations for distribution in the cities. So these failures were there, no doubt, due to which the farmers suffered and the consumers also suffered. In fact, IG IDR, Sudha Narayan has written a paper in which she has tracked the prices, and the prices went up by 5 to 8%, which is a moderate increase, not too bad, keeping in mind the lockdown and restrictions on movement. But even this was not justified because of destruction of demand from hotel, restaurant, and catering sector. Now, thirdly, the outlook. I think the outlook for Rabi is quite good. The prediction of normal monsoon by IMD brings hope, and we hope that all the preparation for Rabi crop will be done in time. I have spoken to the managing director of the National Seed Corporation and also some southern states. They say that seeds have largely been placed in most of the places, and fertilizer sales are slightly higher than last year, which is very well done. So seed availability is good, fertilizer is good. In the eastern states, the labor availability is going to be more than years in the past. Therefore, there will not be any problem in sowing, transplantation of paddy, etc. in eastern India. However, in northwestern states of Punjab, Haryana, I think there is going to be shortage of labor, due to which farmers may either switch to some other crop. There are reports that they may switch to cotton, some farmers, and also perhaps more technology will be used. So we may see more use of direct seeders for paddy in Punjab and Haryana, which will be a technological shift, which will also impact the employment of labor in future years. Also, if the restrictions on movement continue, then the mango farmers may suffer. And similarly, farmers of several other crops, if they are not able to find the markets, they will suffer. Lastly, let me say that even before COVID-19 hit, in its very extreme form, poultry was in extremely bad shape because of fake news on social media. And this has completely destroyed the poultry farmers in North India. And we find that even today, as I'm talking in UP, sale of meat, chicken, poultry, fish is not permitted, as a result of which poultry farmers are in very bad shape. Similarly, the milk farmers suffered due to destruction of demand. And in many cases, the private dairies are paying 10 rupees less per liter to dairy farmers. So on the whole, agriculture sector is not as badly placed as the industrial sector. And despite all the problems, it has performed quite well. And I think if the monsoon is normal, we should see a normal Rabi. Thanks.
Thank you, Siraj Saab, for those very insightful comments. I think what it also gives us hope, especially as the debate of saving lives and livelihoods comes to the fore in India now. And I'm sure Radhicka is going to talk to us about labor markets and livelihoods when she talks about what is happening to labor as a result of COVID-19. So Radhicka, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think all the speakers before me have already laid out the context of the discussion very well. So I'm going to jump in straight to the issue about labor markets. COVID-19, of course, is both a health shock and an economic shock, which has had an unprecedented impact on labor markets. Globally, we've seen in the United States where there are rising claims for unemployment insurance. As of yesterday, it was a record high of 30 million. In India, the only data we have available at this moment is from the CMIE. And according to their data, since the lockdown was announced, the unemployment rate has fluctuated anywhere between 21 to 26%. And this is about a threefold increase from the 7-8% that they had registered last year at the same time. And I'm not going to be as optimistic as Siraj sir. This is really just the tip of the iceberg. And I think there's going to be a further deterioration in the labor market conditions in India, largely because a very large proportion of our workforce is in informal work arrangements, and they're woefully ill-prepared to cope with the shock of such a magnitude. So I'm going to divide my talk really into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to try and understand what the impact of COVID-19 is on labor markets. And in order to do this, I would explain what the workforce looks like at this point, using the 2017-18 data from the periodic labor force. And then in the latter half, touch on a possible few policy responses, both for the short term, the immediate term, and the medium long term as well. So I think pretty much everybody is aware that about 75% of India's workforce is either self-employed or it's in casual work. So naturally, these people are outside the ambit of standard employer-employee relationships. They have no security of tenure, no social protection. They have no written contracts. So they are really very precarious. They are the ones who are likely to face significant job losses or income losses, livelihoods, especially for the own-account workers. But unfortunately, the job losses are not going to be restricted just to casual workers. The regular wage salaried workers are also in quite a precarious position. The regular wage salaried workers account for about 22% of India's workforce, and their vulnerability or precarity can be looked at on the basis of two variables. One, whether they have access to any social security benefits, and second, if they have any written contract with their employer. Now, if you look at the first, access to social security benefits, just about 40% of regular wage salaried workers had access to at least one social security benefit. So what that means is that just about 9% of India's workforce was in what we call regular formal jobs. But this, in a sense, is actually underestimating the extent of the problem, because the definition that we're using of a formal job is based on having access to at least one social security benefit, which is a very relaxed definition. If we actually are a bit more stringent And we look at how many regular wage salaried workers had access to all the social security benefits that are available, so be it EPF, gratuity, health, maternity benefits, then that works out to just about 3.8% of the workforce. So we really are underestimating the extent of the precarity when we say that just 90% of people are precarious. There are a lot more with regular formal jobs also who are precarious. The other parameter is that we look at the security of tenure of regular wage salaried workers. And it's striking that 70% of regular wage salaried workers in India had no written contract. Just 21% of the regular wage salaried workers had a written contract of 3 years or more. Now, if I combine these two variables, your access to a social security benefit and whether you had a written contract, what you find is just that 2%, 2.15% to be precise, are actually regular wage salaried workers who have a written contract of 3 years or more and have access to all social security benefits. So these are the people who are in what we can call as good jobs, which are relatively secure at this point. These are the people who are perhaps least likely to be fired by their employers and have a high is very wide-reaching on the labor force. It's not just restricted to casual workers, but to self-employed and a large proportion of regular wage salaried workers as well. The other issue is that the earnings of these people are in fact very low, and that does not give them the financial wherewithal to actually cope with a crisis of such nature. For example, again, going back to the periodic labor force survey data, what we find is that if you look at casual workers, 94% of them earned less than 375 rupees a day. And where does this 375 figure come from? It's actually a minimum wage that was arrived at by a government-appointed committee. So 94% of casual workers are earning less than 375 a day. If you translate this 375 into a monthly salary, it works out to about 9,750. Even in regular wage salaried workers, if you look at what their earning levels are, about 45%, that's about a half of regular wage salaried workers earn less than what was this minimum wage. So this is actually just reinforcing the fact that they're also financially vulnerable, not just in terms of their contract or social security benefits, but they don't have the incomes or the savings to ride them through this shock. And we can therefore expect a lot of them to slip deeper into poverty. And it's not surprising that the ILO has estimated that about 400 million people are at the risk of falling deeper into poverty in India as a result of COVID-19. And some recent World Bank research suggests that 12 million people are likely to fall into extreme poverty. So that's $1.90 a day, that poverty line. Now, another aspect through which we can get a sense of the vulnerability of the workforce is by looking at the sectoral composition of the workforce. Now, of course, the agricultural sector accounts for the largest share of the workforce. That's 44%. And that, of course, Siraj has already explained very well what the prospects in that sector are. But if you look at the next three sectors, which account for the highest share of employment, there's manufacturing, there's construction, there's trade, hotels, and restaurants. And each of these accounts for about 12% of the workforce. Now, these sectors, again, have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, either because the work that these sectors entails, you can't do it within the framework of physical distancing, or because they face supply side disruptions, or because there's a demand shock. So collectively, what this means is, and these are also the sectors like construction, trade, hotels, and restaurants, and manufacturing. All these sectors basically employ a very large proportion of people who are less educated, which have secondary education and below. And most of the work arrangements in this sector are actually informal in nature. So people have high chances of getting fired. So what's happening in the labor market is that you have a very small proportion of the workforce, which is working in sectors that are relatively less affected by COVID-19, where work can be moved online. These are the people who are relatively more educated. They're in regular formal employment. And on the other hand, you have a large section of the workforce, which is actually in sectors which are at high risk to COVID-19. They have informal work arrangements. Their earnings are also considerably lower. So what that means is that we're going to see widening disparities in the labor market as a consequence of COVID-19. And this is really worrying. It's a deep crisis, because we have to remember that this problem is coming on the back of already high unemployment and already high underemployment. The periodic labor force survey data that we saw last year was actually, a 45-year high in the open unemployment rate. We're typically used to seeing unemployment rates in the range of 2 to 3%. So,
Hi, Radhicka, just last couple of minutes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, it was a bad situation, and COVID-19 has made it already worse. So what are we going to do to deal with this? I will quickly summarize, because I don't have too much time. Firstly, what we have to recognize is that we need a very clear and comprehensive strategy, a plan that places productive employment generation at the center of a strategy of macroeconomic stabilization and revival. This is important not just because we need to create good jobs, because that's an end in itself, but because we are hit by a demand problem as well, which was in the Indian economy even before COVID-19 struck. So if we're actually able to create well-paying, more secure jobs, then that can help us ride through some of this demand problem. So what do you do about it? In the short term, I think there is near universal consensus. We need direct income transfers. Of course, they need to be much more broad-based than what we have seen the government do, because as the statistics I showed you highlight, the extent of the damage is really widespread. We need to help firms protect whatever regular, formal, good jobs that they have. We have to try and repurpose and reallocate workers in the short run from sectors where there is low demand to sectors where there is high demand. In the long run, because as I said, this is a problem which has been festering for a very long time, there's a need to strengthen workfare programs, strengthen NREGA, also extension in urban areas. We need an industrial policy that focuses on employment-intensive industries. India was already in the midst of preparing one, but I think here we're going to need to rethink our strategy, because trade and global value chains are probably going to be a less important driver of growth and job creation, at least in the medium term. We have to think of hiring subsidies for creating more formal jobs, like we've seen through the PMRPY program that the government ran for 3 years. And finally, I think we have to start thinking of the idea of establishing a universal labor guarantee. It was an idea which was proposed in the ILO Centenary Declaration, which essentially said that all workers, regardless of the nature of the contract, whether they were self-employed, casual, regular, whatever, everybody was entitled to basic rights at work, living wages, safe and healthy workplaces, limits to working hours, and right to collective bargaining. And this is, of course, a very, very ambitious target, but it's important because we are only going to see an increase in the number of informal work arrangements actually across the world, probably post-COVID-19, because employers are going to be reluctant to bear the fixed costs of hiring workers and pay those social security costs. So just to conclude, I think that the importance of productive employment generation cannot be overemphasized at this point. We've already seen a medical crisis turn into an economic and a humanitarian crisis. And if the anger and the frustration of the unemployed is not addressed by providing them with good jobs, then this can also turn into a social crisis, and we don't need that. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhicka. That's exactly right. We need to ensure that this doesn't turn into a social and a humanitarian crisis. And one of the things that India was able to do well between 2004 and 2008, when it grew on average at 8.5%, 9%, it was able to lift people out of poverty. 140 million odd people were lifted out of poverty. And as you're saying, the risk as a result of these declining growth rates, very low growth rates, or zero growth rates, and the risk of the pandemic will mean that this health shock becomes an economic shock, and the risk and the vulnerabilities in the labor force means that we could be creating many more, a mass scale of poverty, many more than we were able to extricate as a result of our high growth rate. So we have to sort of reorient and restructure our structural transformation model, absolutely. And I think that needs careful attention of policymakers as well. Let's move to the trade impacts, and Anirudh is going to talk to us about the services trade and the impact as a result of COVID-19. And feel free, Anirudh, to also sort of foray into goods, if you like, but I know that you're going to speak on services. You need to unmute yourself, Anirudh.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Anush.
Anirudh, by any chance, if you have YouTube playing in your on your laptop on a separate tab, I think it's a good idea to shut it down.
Okay, let me just check. Give me 1 second. Sorry, just give me 1 second.
Yeah. I think it's fine.
It's fine now? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
great.
perfect.
Perfect. Yeah. So thank you so much, Rajat. I'm trying to share my screen. Is that visible now?
Yeah, it's visible.
It's visible. Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about trade. Clearly, this is a pandemic of huge proportions. It's led to an immediate supply shock because of the lockdown and stalling the economic activity. And from then on, a more consistent and persistent demand. Together, this means that it's leading to problems which arguably may not have been witnessed in the last 100 years. There have been while primarily it's a health crisis, it's got spillovers on the labor market, as Radhicka has just spoken about. There are problems for health, for agriculture, food security, and of course even for trade, because there's going to be a disruption. There already is a disruption of both global and domestic supply chains, and there are problems. Now, what I'm going to argue is that it's not just about goods trade; it's also about services trade. And what I'd like to say is really that service trade is actually going to be the biggest casualty emanating from COVID. And there are a couple of reasons I'm going to say that. It turns out that there are 4 ways in which services are transacted internationally. And 3 out of those 4 ways of trading in services requires physical proximity between buyers and sellers. And this, as it turns out, has been the first casualty of social distancing and related practices that have been imposed either formally or voluntarily in the wake of COVID-19. And this is a huge problem. At the same time, services are extremely important for the economy and also in the context of India. The sector accounts for more than 50% of India's GDP. It employs about 30% of the country's labor force. In gross terms, trade and services is about 30% of India's total trade in goods and services. But in fact, on the export side, services are even more important. And it turns out that since 2010, the share of India's services exports in global services exports is around 3.5%, which is double the share of India's merchandise exports in world exports of goods. So clearly, services is where a lot of the action is. This is only on the gross side in balance of payments terms. If you look at the importance of services in value-added terms, then the share of services in total trade actually doubles. It goes up beyond 50%. So that's how important services is in the Indian context. And in fact, services are used as inputs in almost all sectors of economic activity. This is the so-called servicification that is being observed in countries across the world, including in India. And in fact, services are inputs also in almost everything that MSMEs produce, which is about 30% of India's GDP. So clearly the sector is very important. When you look at India's services exports, however, you will see that this is driven by a couple of sectors: computer and related services and professional management business services on the export side. On the import side, the dominant categories are travel services and transport services. But there are only a couple of sectors where India actually exhibits a revealed comparative advantage, i.e. these are the sectors where India is more cost competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world in exporting services. And these are, again, the computer services and the professional management business consulting services. In the other sectors, however, India is not really cost competitive with respect to the rest of the world. And this has strong implications for recovery even in the aftermath of COVID. And the reason for that is that a lot of these services at least some of these services will continue to be traded by modes of supply which require proximity between buyers and sellers, which, as I've already said, is the first casualty in the wake of COVID-19. Now, just a bit of background, the WTO, the General Agreements on Trade and Services of the WTO, provides 4 ways by which services are traded across borders. 30% of all global trade and services is actually transacted by Mode 1, which is basically the group of services that are transacted over the internet. So these are things like financial services, telecom services, computer services, some business services. A lot of these services are transacted over the internet. And a lot of these services are still those kinds of sectors where activity will continue even in work from home scenarios. So these will, the likelihood of these being compromised in the wake of COVID is relatively more limited. But having said that, the remaining 70% of global services, trade and services, is in categories and is driven by modes of supply, which require a lot of proximity between the buyer and the seller. So this includes Mode 4, which is the movement of natural persons. The classic example is
Anirudh, are you also sharing your screen at the moment?
No, I'm not. I was experiencing some technical problems.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This is one to clarify. Thanks.
So Mode 4, which is the movement of natural persons, that's basically the classic example of that is the Indian software professional working on site abroad, where the service supplier is actually moving to the destination of the consumer to deliver a service. So that requires physical proximity. Then Mode 2, which is consumption abroad, the classic example of which is health services, medical tourism or education services, students traveling abroad, where the consumer is actually traveling to the source of the service. And once again, there is a clear proximity between the buyer and seller. And a lot of the hospitality related services, all of these are going to be hugely compromised in the wake of COVID-19. But the bulk of services trade, the mode of delivery which accounts for the bulk of services trade is actually Mode 3 or commercial presence, which is essentially FDI services, which accounts for nearly 60% of all services trade. And that again requires proximity between the buyer and seller. And all of these categories are going to be hugely compromised in the wake of COVID. And arguably, because of social distancing and related practices, will also take much longer to recover, even vis-a-vis the last 2008 global financial crisis, where services actually, in contrast to the manufacturing sector, were amongst the fastest to register recovery. So this time around, recovery in services is going to be a bigger problem. And why this is more important is because services are used as inputs in various sectors of economic activity. In fact, data released by the WTO recently on the basis of the OECD's trade and value-added database suggests that services embodied in manufacturing exports are as much as 30 to 35% across the range of manufacturing export sectors. And even within services, the services embodied in the exports of other services may be as high as 90%. So not only is it a direct effect, it's also an indirect effect, which leads to spillover effects on the entire economy. And so to the extent that countries get under pressure to impose restrictions, even legitimately for health reasons, it's important that these restrictions do not become prohibitive. It's important that borders remain open, because if this doesn't happen, this is going to be a huge problem for the recovery of the economy in the aftermath of this crisis. And so clearly services are important. And having said that, I'd like to, before I conclude, look at a few policy options, policy priorities for India. So first and foremost, of course, the idea is that, I think the most important thing is that countries should refrain from imposing export restrictions, not just on COVID-19 goods and services, but even on agricultural commodities. And in fact, at the WTO, there has been a movement in this direction where countries have voluntarily undertaken not to impose increased tariffs or impose barriers on agricultural trade. So that is actually a step in the right direction. So this definitely needs to be followed up. At the same time, I think countries should also use this as an opportunity to remove both tariff and non-tariff barriers, not just in COVID-19 goods and services, but even generally. Because these are troubled times. As Radhicka already mentioned, the country, India was already in a precarious situation before this crisis. So it's very important that we do everything that is possible to keep both domestic and international borders open, and to prevent any further disruption of even the domestic supply chains. That's very important. So this is priority from a trade perspective. Then I think another thing that India could do right now is to unshackle the domestic e-commerce sector. Now, we have a draft e-commerce policy, and arguably some of the provisions in that would not be in favor of the domestic e-commerce sector. So it might be the right time to revisit some of these provisions. For instance, those on data localization, because that also then has a positive effect on India's Mode 1 services trade. Now, while the classic picture or the traditional picture of the Indian software programmer is one that goes around, I think what a lot of people do not know that not just internationally, but even in India, almost 3/4 of India's IT services exports are now delivered online. So Mode 1 is actually the new game. And any kind of data localization that India would impose in the context of e-commerce policy is actually going to boomerang on us. So it's important that we keep that in mind. We liberalize, we keep barriers down, because that has a positive spillover effect on the rest of the economy. At the same time, I think one very useful policy response to counteract the macroeconomic shock emanating from COVID is the use of reason. In some research, continental free trade area, and I find trade liberalization under this agreement is likely to facilitate greenfield investment within Africa. And so this is one policy mechanism that can be used effectively. And clearly, this is also one way to get back regional value chains, especially in a current scenario or in the current climate, where there might be a tendency for countries to move away from other major dominant players in supply chains. So India could also explore new market access opportunities in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and at the same time also remain open to preferential trade agreements. Right? We need to learn from our experiences in the RCEP negotiations, and we need to remain positive. We need to remain open. And in fact, one great thing that India could do would be to join the plurilateral trade liberalization initiative of New Zealand and Singapore, which has since seen more members joining this initiative, which not just liberalizes or decides not to impose barriers on COVID-19 goods and services, but even on agricultural and other essential commodities. So that again is a step in the right direction. And if India could take the lead and join such a plurilateral trade initiative, it also projects India within the G20. And in fact, just to round that up, we all realize, we all appreciate that COVID is actually a global pandemic. It's a global crisis, and global crises, by definition, require global coordinated responses. Unfortunately, that requires leadership, which unfortunately is lacking at the moment. So if India could galvanize support in favor of multilateral action, not just on the trade front, but even on the health front, this could be the best global response to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Anirudh, for those insightful remarks. And if you allow me, I will pick on some of the things that you said right at the end, and that forms a segue into what I wanted to say. So I'm just going to reshuffle what I was going to say, and using the last couple of remarks that you made about G20 and a coordinated response, and why that becomes absolutely necessary to do at this moment, because the natural tendency, as you said, is for countries to impose export restrictions, especially on health-related products. And we've seen that a lot across the world. And that leads to, of course, competitive beggar thy neighbor policies, as we so well know, that one country imposes an export restrictions and they want to shield the consumers of their own countries from high price rises or high prices, and another country also imposes that. And we've seen that in food in 2004, in wheat and in rice, and we are seeing that today. Although what we are also seeing, which is a good sign, is that some of the tariffs on import of medical equipment has been brought down to zero by countries like United States. But that is for their self-serving reasons, because what they need is medical equipment, and they're willing to import this medical equipment at zero prices. But I think I want to pick up on what you said. How is it possible to have solidarity? And I think the pandemic creates both kinds of reactions. One reaction is to become more protectionist. You want to shield your consumers from price increases, especially of protective equipment. and pharmaceutical products and masks and ventilators, respirators, etc. And on the end, because this is a global pandemic, because this is affecting every country in the world, you want to have a coordinated response. And unfortunately, the WTO as a multilateral institution is today not working really well in terms of deriving a coordinated response. So as you mentioned, maybe bilateralism, or I think the G20 today as a multilateral institution can become the forum, can become the platform where we can engender this solidarity which the desperately need. This is not a pandemic. This is not something that countries are going to be able to do on their own. And therefore, I think the G20 becomes the natural platform through which we can try and get coordinated responses. Of course, you know, to able to do that, I think what we need is trust in the system. And one of the big casualties of the last few years, I think the decade, especially the more recent times, has been the breakdown of trust, especially among the big powers. We've seen a breakdown of trust. And once you have breakdown of trust, then it's difficult to arrive at a coordinated solution. But I hope that the G20 in Saudi Arabia next time in Italy, and then we become the presidency in 2022, I hope you're able to develop some of those coordinated responses. But, you know, in technology, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the ideas that we have and some of the ideas that we are going to start working on in ICRIER as well on technology and the response that we could have. Obviously, everybody has been reading in the newspapers and in the media and watching on television that technology has been one of the gainers, or technology products has been one of the gainers of COVID. And you've seen that you know, share prices of certain companies have risen. Some of the technology companies have also begun to offer, I said, related products. So your taxi hailing companies have begun to offer food delivery services, etc., to make use of the infrastructure that they already have so they can serve what the demand is. And I think you have to be agile and responsive, and companies in the digital space are agile and responsive. And to the extent that policy allows that, that could be one response. But I think what India can do in this space is really become the hub, try and become the hub for innovation, for frugal innovation. As Radhicka was pointing out, and Siraj Sab was also pointing out, that, you know, one of the things that has happened as a result of this pandemic is that we started with a discussion on saving lives, and we relegated livelihoods to an extent to, we'll take care of this later. But very soon it has become apparent that the cost of what we are doing will be imposing huge burdens on livelihoods. So we need to do something to save livelihoods as well. And that is what Radhicka was saying. And there has to be a sort of a progressive lifting up of the lockdown. And when we say progressive lifting up of the lockdown, and notwithstanding all the comments that Anirudh made and Radhicka made about social distancing will have to be maintained when you have a calibrated sort of strategy to get away from the lockdown, you will still have to have social distancing in factories. You will still have to have protective equipment. You still have to have masks, and the production of that will need to continue. And I think what India can do is to try and increase manufacturing of personal protective equipment, increase production of these masks and respirators, etc., using frugal innovation. This is an opportunity to sort of get rid of that tag of jugaad and say that we can do frugal innovation and we can use, because I think lifting the lockdown would need, you know, they will create an enormous demand for this equipment. And I think not only in India, but I think it will create an enormous demand for this equipment across the world. And India is pretty well placed, I think, given that we can, you know, move some of our production lines to producing some of this, as we have already experienced. So this is, I think, something that we can do. But in order to do that, we will need to ensure, as Anirudh was saying, we don't become too protectionist ourselves, and we don't impose export bans ourselves, because if we impose export bans, then there would be competitive pressure on others to do it as well. And that may not be a very good thing for trade to happen. The second, I want to make a couple of other points. The second point I wish to make is sort of trying to, you know, lifting the gloom and doom of of the pandemic and COVID-19. Of course, we have to be realistic. There is a lot of gloom around. But again, if you read newspaper articles, if you read the media, not only in India, but across the world, but certainly in India, one of the things that comes out is that the levels of air pollution, the levels of the destruction of our natural habitat, all of that, we've seen a drastic improvement in that. And often then that translates into a debate on, well, we have to sacrifice growth to get a better environment. We have to ensure that we don't have too resource-intensive growth models to get the benefit of the environment. I think that's looking at the problem exactly the wrong way. We can have high growth, but we need to be able to step up our policies on trying to use technology to deliver some of the benefits, and of course policies to also deliver some of the benefits. And what I mean is that in the aftermath of demonetization, I mean, to take you back to 2016, there was a lot of emphasis on digital transactions. Although once money came back into the system, the number of digital transactions declined, but of late they've begun to go up. So there was a behavioral change towards using more digital transactions, towards cashless transactions. And I think one of the things that this crisis can help us with is if we can have a behavioral change. There is public opinion that is building up towards in favor of a cleaner environment. There's public opinion building up that we were being too resource intensive. We were doing, our growth model was too fossilized, to use a pun, was dependent too much on fossil fuels. And now they recognize that we could do with a better environment, but that getting a better environment is not going to be preordained. So what I'm saying is, what one could think about is trying to develop a much better growth model, trying to engender behavioral change, using much more of technology. Can we, for example, do away with travel, reduce the carbon footprint, and use technology much more? Travel, which is not necessary, can be then, like we are communicating today. Of course, this is a small example, but I'm sure technologists can help this scale up. We will not only need technology, but at the same time, we need some policies. But this is, I think, something positive that can come out. Look at a growth model that is much more clean, which is structurally more sustainable. The second aspect Radhicka has already mentioned that I wanted to talk about, have a much more inclusive growth model.
I'm
going to
couple
conclude.
of minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to conclude. Great. And have a much more inclusive growth model. And that requires investments in social security architecture. We need, quasi universal income, etc. So Radhicka has already spoken about that. I want to speak of two more things, and then I'll conclude, and I'll make them very, very quick. One of the things that the pandemic has also brought out is that we need to really suppress it, and for suppressing it so that we can sort of get rid of the lockdown, or at least calibrate, reduce a reduction of the lockdown. And can we use technology to isolate people or do contact tracing? And countries like South Korea, countries like Taiwan have done that really well. And the debate that has emerged in that is that, do you sort of compromise when you're doing contact tracing? And we have our own app that in India, and apps will only work if there are a large number of people that download them. Otherwise, they won't work. You have network effects, so you need a large number of people to download those apps. And if they are to be successful, a large population, a mass population, should have access to those apps. But contact tracing can be a way to sort of quarantine and isolation, so that the people who are not infected or people who are healthy can then go back to the workforce and go back to working. But this raises questions, and it has already raised questions, including in Europe and including in India, on what does this mean for privacy. We don't have our data privacy bill in place yet, but in GDPR, for example, in Europe, exceptions to privacy are already written into public health. Just like in the WTO, exceptions for imposing tariff restrictions or quantitative restrictions are already written into the rules on the basis of public health. So in GDPR, exclusions for public health are already written into the general data protection rules. But the citizens almost always fear that there would be a loss of privacy. But somebody who's sitting at home for many, many days will be willing to give up some amount of privacy for the sake of getting some amount of liberty in terms of going out. So again, this debate between privacy, you get more liberty, but you sacrifice privacy. This is another thing that I think we should discuss and discourse within India as our data protection rules become sort of more clear and are adapted. And the last thing I'm going to say, Ayush, and then I'll stop, is that technology has to be used much more and is being used much more in telemedicine. We have now guidelines for telemedicine the government of India has put out, and I think we should begin to use telemedicine and teleeducation in whatever manner we can, so that we can use technology more effectively. The numbers, as Ali was saying, number of hospital beds per population, numbers of doctors per population in India is so low and is so abysmal that whatever saving that can happen as a result of technology and telemedicine and getting prescriptions, through the digital interface will serve us very well in the future. So we should, and this is an opportunity to be able to entrench that and make that much more pervasive in the system. A lot of times we just talk about it, pay lip service to it, but now that the guidelines are out, hopefully that will make much more progress in that. And lastly, our telecom sector is seeing a lot of stress as a result of the huge pressure that is being put on bandwidth, on infrastructure. And I think it's time that the government, looks at it and says, okay, I'm willing to do something for the sector that is going to serve us for many, many decades into the future. In fact, the telecom sector could become a part of the fiscal stimulus that the government wishes to do once the recovery starts happening of the economy. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions later on. What I would now request all the sort of attendees to do is, those of you are on Zoom and wish to ask questions can raise your hands, and Ayush and Rajkumar there will unmute you. And those of you who are on YouTube, please type out your questions, identify the panelists, and we'll sort of read out the question. Ayush will read out the question, and we'll try our best to get back to you. But thank you so much for your patient hearing, and the floor is now open for questions. I see Rupa.
Rajkumar, can we start unmuting the ones on Zoom? I think in the meanwhile, we can have one question that's come from YouTube. This is for Siraj sir from Kriti Shah from MK Global.
Not audible. Not audible. Ayush?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. And
yeah.
Can you mute when you're reading out the question? Can you mute the people who are going to ask questions? We can sequentially take the questions. So that
right.
Yes. Go ahead.
Right. So this one is for Siraj sir, and Kriti Shah from MK Global says that 86% of the capacity with the Food Corporation of India and the state procurement agencies is already being utilized. So wouldn't procurement as a percentage of total production won't that be impacted in the current scenario? This is for Siraj sir.
I think this year the procurement is not going to be adversely impacted because of any shortage of storage capacity, because the state government as well as the FCI will do everything in their power to procure as much as possible. So I don't think it will be impacted by COVID or shortage of storage capacity.
Can we have someone from Zoom now? I think Rajkumar, can you unmute them?
Yeah, Madan Lal is in.
Okay.
Yeah. Madan Lal in here. Actually, I just wanted to have the idea that Prime Minister wants that India should be self-reliant, and on the other hand, we also want to have global coordination. we are also having this poverty rate going very high, and how will be dealing with this, taking into consideration these 5-6 months of said social distancing? Any panelist can answer that.
Anirudh, do you want to take that question? You'll unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Rajat. So this is where we, this is where we tread the thin line between self-sufficiency and globalization, in a sense. Now, as I said, this is a global pandemic. It ideally requires a global coordinated response. That's the first best. If that is not happening, then at least regional cooperation is a must. But you have to understand that recovery in the aftermath of this pandemic is not just going to be dependent on what's happening within India, but also internationally. Given that we are a large services exporter, and which essentially means that for us to be able to export our services to the rest of the world, those markets need to be open and liberal for our exports. And that can only happen if there is a coordinated policy response. So at the same time, there are certain certain things which can only be dealt with domestically, and for those, for instance, you need to act within the domestic framework. But for other things where you need market access, where you need global coordination, it's important that these things are done together, and there's an element of cooperation. I mean, a good instance of that is what is happening to the demand and supply for COVID goods and services. While on the one hand, countries need not to impose export bans, as even Rajat was saying, at the same time, from an importing country perspective, you would want to lower down barriers on the imports of these goods and services. And therefore, together, this is a coordinated policy response.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I also just want to reiterate. I think we learned the very hard way, Mr. Madan Lal. We learned the very hard way that in order to be competitive, we need to open up, and that lesson pre-91 is loud and clear. Of course, there's going to be increasing protectionism in the backdrop of COVID, and every country is going to become more or less protectionist. But as Anirudh is saying, and I think it's the right way, is that eventually we will need to be able to coordinate a response which makes globalization less of a sort of monster that we portray globalization. Globalization is almost always blamed for things that it does not do. But in the immediate aftermath, there is going to be increasing protectionism. There's no question about that. But we need to coordinate so that it doesn't become entrenched, and we return to openness in the next 12 to 18 months.
Sorry, Rajat, can I just add there one more thing?
Yes.
We must also understand and appreciate that there is a reason why there are regional value chains and global value chains, because that actually is the most efficient way and the most cost-effective way of doing business.
Yes.
In a world where manufacturing has been fragmented, any attempts at replacing that with domestic value chains is only going to be more costly. Okay, so it's not really the most efficient way of doing things, and that imposes additional costs on the economy, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Other questions, please.
If I have a brief question from Radhicka ji.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, please. Because on the one hand, the problem of unemployment will be there, and on the other hand, if it is not properly tackled, then social consequences will be there of this. So in future also, we need to think about how to absorb this labor so that we actually move towards engaging them. Yeah.
No, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. I take that in the nature of a comment. That was exactly what I was trying to say, that this was a problem that was there from before. It's one which has gotten worse, and handling it is going to be much harder going forward, given that our options are limited. For instance, before this, we believed that export-led, labor-intensive manufacturing could get us out of this crisis. But again, in the medium term, if global value chains, trade are going to be less important drivers of growth and job creation, that might not be the way out. We are going to face a demand problem. A lot of the goods in the manufacturing sector, which are produced by the manufacturing sector, are in fact discretionary spending. It's postponable consumption. So a lot of sectors which we had initially thought might absorb labor are going to be affected. I think Make in India campaign gets harder, even though there is some inspiring talk that India can probably take up the space that's going to be receded by China. But that is going to involve a lot of effort and a lot of reform on the ground before any of this takes off. So this challenge has only gotten harder to solve as a result of COVID-19. And given that we are already seeing a humanitarian crisis playing out with the migrant laborers, it could well turn into a social upheaval if we can't create good jobs.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ekrer, and thank you, Rajat, for invitation.
Done yet? There are more questions.
Yeah.
Let me read. There are questions that I'm going to read out. I see from Rupa. What is the likely long-term structural change one can expect in the labor market? Radhicka, this is to you. Do you see a long-term structural shift in the labor market as a result of COVID?
That's a very tricky question to answer in terms of the long term. This is an evolving situation, and there is a considerable amount of uncertainty about how long this pandemic is going to last, how severe it's going to be. So the long-term structural question is very difficult to answer. But I think what I can say is that we are going to see increasing disparities in the labor market. And we might see that in certain sectors, the way work is done, the way production structures are, those might get altered.
There are more questions that Rupa has asked, but I'll give an opportunity to others, and then I'll come back to some of the questions. Is there anybody else who wants to ask or type a question? Ayush?
Yeah, Rajkumar, do we have anyone on Zoom? Otherwise, I'll pass on a question from you.
There was a question on health also by Rupa.
Yes, there was. I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that.
Let's come back to that. Yeah. I'll pass on a question from YouTube, and this is by Supriya Singhal who's an assistant professor at the University of Rajasthan, and she says, what are the strategies that the government can use to support employers during this pandemic situation so that they don't have to lay off their employees? So this is basically open to whoever wants to take it. But
Siraj sir, do you want to try and attempt that question?
I think Radhicka should answer that.
Radhicka, what are the policies that the government can?
So this is actually a very important question.
Yes.
Because again, the composition of the workforce that I explained, basically, 75% were the self-employed and the casual. So they're outside the ambit of a standard employer-employee relationship. So we can't talk about those when we're talking about, protecting people in their jobs. But the regular wage salaried workers, because anyway, there's such few of these regular wage salaried workers and even fewer regular formal workers, I think that we need to make a serious effort to ensure that they stay protected in their jobs. This is important also because some of these people have firm-specific capital, and you don't want that to be destroyed during a recession. So how do you protect that? I think one of the ways is the way the UK has gone, the way Denmark has gone, where the government actually takes over the wage costs of the firm so that they can retain these employees. And again, it can be argued that this has limited relevance in the Indian context, and that's partially true because most of the workers are informal. But whatever few they are, I think the government has to step in and bear the wage costs, or give firms wage support in order to be able to retain those workers. Because the employers, firms themselves are really not in a position at this point, given that they're facing a liquidity crunch, there's supply side disruptions, there's demand shortage, all this coming together, and on top of them to expect that they should be paying their workers in full when production is anyway at reduced capacity is not reasonable. So there have been some suggestions from the MSME Council saying that, okay, maybe some of the funds that are lying with the EPF can be used, some of the funds lying with ISEC can be used, but whatever is the framework they develop, the important thing is that the state has to step in and give that wage support to firms.
Thanks, Radhika. There is a question from Rupa and there's a question from Mansi. So Rupa's question is, Ali, do you believe the numbers that are coming out? And she's typed a question, so you can see that on your screen. But it says, do you believe the numbers, or are we doing inadequate testing?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to believe those numbers given the risk factors that we have in India to COVID-19. Poverty and population density, the elderly population. We have the world's second largest elderly population in India. And the poverty levels are extremely high, density is extremely high. So given the risk factors, it is very difficult to believe these numbers. Without testing it, we cannot really have the real picture. The other thing we can do is think of proxies. For example, in the case of antimicrobial resistance, we also look at the sale of antimicrobials and take that as a proxy of the prevalence of antimicrobial resistance. But in the case of COVID-19, there are no medicines, there are no vaccines available. So we cannot also look at the sale of these medicines. I mean, to look at the sale of paracetamol, for example, for fever, or for cough syrups, the other symptoms of COVID-19. That would be difficult to draw conclusions from the sale of these medicines. But I think it would be a good exercise to look for proxies, given that our testing facilities, are very suboptimal. So I think that is something that needs to be done here.
Sir, Mansi have a question, and
yes.
Rajiv Johari.
Yeah. Siraj, here is a question for you. Why did some states do better than others in their response? What are the factors?
It is true that some states have better infrastructure, both in terms of physical infrastructure as well as in terms of human infrastructure. So Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, lately Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, Chhattisgarh, etc. have created a very credible infrastructure for procurement, while Bihar continues to lag behind. So in fact, Bihar is so low that it is not even discussed. It is true that eastern states need to do much more.
There is a question on global value chains, and I think Anirudh, you might want to take that. Let me also add to somebody called Rupa who's asking this question. For global value chains, will there be a backlash? And this is, I guess, based on the growing sort of concern against China, the isolation and geographical diversification of global value chains. Where do you see that going? And also, if I may add, I've been sort of reading this for my own interest in services trade, which is that, the just-in-time aspect of global value chains might be sort of moderated a little bit in people in the light of the pandemic, and for other reasons, they might, take on much more inventory rather than because the entire, production line gets hostage to the non-delivery of one component, which is the weakest link in the chain. So there's geographical diversification, there's resilience, and there's just-in-time. Where do you see sort of these aspects going post-COVID? Anirudh?
Yeah, Rajat. So I think those are very interesting questions. Now, I think as far as global value chains are concerned, I think one must go back to the genesis of GVCs, which is basically advancements in science and technology, which have resulted in the splintering of the manufacturing process and enabled this to happen, right? So clearly there is a reason why this has happened. And while this crisis has probably unearthed the implications of putting all eggs in one basket, I think there might be a movement towards diversifying this portfolio, i.e., moving just beyond China to look at other countries to partner with. But I don't think fundamentally this is going to lead to a shift away from global value chains as they were, because this is fundamentally driven by the splintering of the manufacturing process, which in turn has emanated from advancements in science and technology. So the idea is to be able to do things more efficiently, to be able to reduce costs from a business perspective. And to the extent that that means that you don't localize production, but you have it in different parts of the world, I think those things will still continue. Of course, there will be implications of COVID, one of which is, of course, as I said, look for other partners. There might also be a tendency to localize certain businesses and to have some sort of a cost-benefit analysis to evaluate the net benefits from moving something closer to home, given the kind of risks involved with pandemics such as COVID. So there's going to be that kind of an assessment. But I don't think it's going to completely change the business model that has developed in the last 20 years. I think one interesting addition to that is, and even that might get affected now, is the whole concept of automation. Because if you think about it, and if you think about workers in factories getting affected by these kinds of pandemics, in a world where such workers were replaced by robots, you effectively minimize the chances of the pandemic getting spread, right? So I don't know. I think from a policy perspective, there are different policy options, and which will have different implications, not just for trade, but also on the labor market.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The one thing on services trade, and I think this is interesting, what are the new kind of opportunities that are likely to emerge? I think one thing that is emerging straight away is homeschooling, for instance, right? So if you think about education services, a lot of these are now getting delivered online. Think about this virtual seminar today. A lot of conference travel is likely to be substituted by online conferences, which is already happening. So I can see a lot of innovation that Rajat already spoke about in terms of trying to substitute services which were currently delivered via modes 2 and 4. Development of new apps, even in terms of hospitality services, more food being delivered home, all kinds of services, new developments there, innovation there, which leads to more mode 1 and reduces proximity between buyers and sellers, at least till such time as there is a cure for this vaccine ready for mass deployment.
No, absolutely. I think that is absolutely right. And the thing about splintering of the value chain and science and technology, Paul Krugman has written that containerization has been one of the biggest sort of innovations in services and in manufacturing trade, components trade, which allows parts and components to move very rapidly between countries. And sometimes a part crosses a border multiple times, not just once, but it crosses a border multiple times before the final product is produced. But I think the interest in India has always been to try and attract us as much of the value chain into India as possible, especially in electronics. We haven't succeeded there, but I think part of this crisis, part of the policy response to this crisis, as Radhicka was mentioning, could be an industrial policy that gets us to locate this part of the electronics manufacturing chain in India. We've done a bit, but we could do a lot more. I know that we are running out of time. We've already run out of time, but I think we can take a couple of more questions. And before we close, are there more questions?
One of the questions that's coming from Dr. Shivani Raheja on YouTube is, in the current situation, how do you generate more employment? We're going to have an employment crisis now, but what are the ways in which employment can be generated in the current situation?
Radhicka, do you want to take that?
Sure. So actually, I mean, that's one of I listed some of the policy recommendations. I went over them a bit quickly, but I can just go over it again. I think apart from what we have to do in the immediate or the short term, we need to put in place a policy that realizes the importance of, or we need to have a plan, not a policy rather, that places this productive employment generation at the center of it. And that would include elements like, one, having an industrial policy. Now, this industrial policy is actually very important. It's something that we have been thinking of doing for a long time, but we're now going to have to rethink how we're going to do in industrial policy, given all these changes in the global architecture. It would be important to identify industries which are employment intensive, which have strong backward and forward linkages with other sectors in the economy. That would be one way. The other would be to actually put in place hiring subsidies like the Pradhan Mantri Rozgar Protsahan Yojana, which the government had launched, which was actually quite successful, which boosted formal hiring because the government was bearing social security costs. I think strengthening Narega is extremely important, despite the fact that there is, some people sort of look at it with some amount of suspect. I think it plays a very important role in employment generation, productive asset creation, and also providing a wage floor in a labor surplus economy where workers have no bargaining power. I also think it's important to extend a workfare program to urban areas, because the crisis might be more prolonged in urban areas, because the length of the lockdown, the severity of the lockdown is likely to be more in urban areas. And also there is considerable scope for generation of urban assets. So that can be plugged into with an employment generation program to give an urban guarantee program. I also think that education and health, the provision of essential services, can create an important avenue for generation of jobs. So I think these four basic things can help in employment creation and also pushing our structural transformation in a direction that allows employment growth. Because what we've seen in India so far is that the nature of structural transformation that we have seen, we've had a leapfrogging from agricultural-led growth to service-led growth. And that service-led growth has not actually created much employment for large masses of the low-skilled people who essentially dominate our workforce. So we need to alter that path, go back to the industrial sector, be it manufacturing, construction, which are more employment intensive, in addition to all the other things that I said.
There are a couple of more questions here, very interesting questions. One is from my good friend Arvind Gupta, and Anirudh, may I ask you to take a stab at this question? I think you can see it on the screen. Arvind Gupta asks, Anirudh, are you there? The thrust of the discussion seems to be that we should have more of globalization and not less of it. Is this the right way for India and its problems?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question. I personally feel that I think we are too far ahead now on the path of globalization to have a fundamental rethink and go completely in the opposite direction. Having said that, events like this pandemic make countries introspect, individuals introspect. And what I also mentioned in my own policy priorities for the country is, I think, not so much in terms of intensifying globalization, but probably more in terms of coordination and cooperation, which does not necessarily translate into globalization all the time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're exporting more goods and services or you are getting more investment from abroad. But what essentially means is that you are coordinating policy actions in such a way that there is a tendency or there is an inclination to provide a global good. And I think that is what is more important right now.
Yes. And Arvindji,
May I just add quickly just one point here?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that there have been pandemics in the past also when there was less globalization. So the pandemic is not a result of globalization. Rather, what we see is that there have been far fewer cases and far fewer deaths because of globalization, because of global cooperation. So I don't think there is necessarily a linkage between globalization and pandemic, because they have been there throughout history.
Ayush, can you unmute Mr. Arvind Gupta? He wants to say
I
something?
think he's unmute.
Yes, he's unmuted.
I think he can
Arvindji, go ahead.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir.
Okay. I think in this discussion, briefly, this question about self-reliance was mentioned, but not really discussed. While I agree that we are living in a we have to have a more global coordination and cooperation. After all, we are living in a globalized world. But what globalization has exposed is its tremendous weaknesses. The pandemic traveled through because the world had already shrunk, and now it is out, and it is very difficult to put it back. Number one. Number two, the responses that we have seen. I mean, you might say that we should have more cooperation, but that's not happening, and it's unlikely to happen because the pandemic has gone so deep. And the way the US and China today are fighting, and the way WHO has been politicized, and the way every single multilateral fora, G20, G7, SCO, and you name it, BRICS, there is absolutely no coordination that is happening, and they can't do it. That is the problem. So as it is, we were seeing even before the pandemic hit us, to build consensus on anything was becoming very difficult. I mean, we haven't had a proper convention on some of the issues that we have been facing, say cybersecurity, for instance. For 20 years, we have had no agreement. So I think today, if the world seems to be fragmenting, and you can see this even in European Union, which is otherwise has been a fairly successful European project, but the Chinese have gone in and they have created a lot of problems. You look at ASEAN, ASEAN is divided. So who are these countries? New Zealand and Singapore and Australia? Are they going to lead this world into a coordinated response when the biggies are fighting with each other? So I think globalization, which had hidden a lot of problems, now those problems have been exposed. So I'm not saying good or bad. My point is, this is the reality.
Right.
It is in this that we have, and there are, I mean, all these issues of jobless growth that India itself has experienced. Now we have to look at it. I mean, I think what Radhika ji was saying, and where the simple to a layman, it would say that we should really be going for labor-intensive industry. We should be protecting our labor. We should also be really all the sectors where, I mean, the manufacturing, etc., has been hollowed out thanks to this hyper-connectivity and hyper-globalization. We have to recover some of it. So this is, I think, some of the questions which we should, and that's where the self-reliance has to be looked at.
Right. No, I think Arvindji, thank you for those points, and I think we'll need to have a bigger discussion. But your points are well taken.
I would like to have a discussion only on self-reliance.
That's it. We will do. But I don't think the way you are characterizing self-reliance today is not the same as what we expect when we were growing up.
Exactly.
It's a different sort of, I think you're talking about
a new self-reliance definition that we have to come.
Yes. Yeah. And we will have a discussion on this. But I think Radhika did mention that, labor-intensive industrial policy. It's not that we have not tried to do that. I think sometimes it fails because of implementation challenges. Rupa has another question. I think it's not a question, it's a comment. I'll just read it out for the benefit of everybody. And I think she's saying something which we've also said on this webinar, is that declining transport and communications costs continue to drive global value change, but governments will want certain production lines to be localized in the future. And I think that's what China did, that's what South Korea did, but they used intelligent industrial policy, which is what Radhika was referring to. And we also would need to do that from the point of view of our own sort of labor, employment, and sustainability and inclusion perspectives also. If there are no other questions or comments,
I think, but we're running out of time.
Yes.
I guess.
Are there any? No. So I think I'm going to bring this webinar to a conclusion, and I'll exercise my sort of moderator's prerogative and not only not have any more questions, but also not give the panelists an opportunity to conclude. But I think they've already concluded, and I'm not going to stick my neck out and try and summarize all that has been said. But one of the things that I must say is that, all the world, including in India, we're going through really difficult times. And already people are comparing these times with the Depression, not with the financial crisis that happened in 2008-9. This is much worse than that because it's affected manufacturing, it's affected services, it's affected labor, it's affected especially the informal sector workers. So it's a grave crisis. But as we already know that people say, especially in India, but not only in India, but everywhere in the world, never waste a good crisis. So this is an opportunity for us to reform, restructure that growth model, make those structural transformations so that we can have sustainability, we can have inclusion, and we can have more employment growth in the future. And I think it is possible. It requires some political will and some more power to the states, because as Siraj Saab was saying, a lot of this will happen at the state level and give the social sectors much more attention than they deserve, as Ali has said, and as Siraj Saab has also said. So thank you all very much. Let me thank Ayush and Rajkumar for organizing this extremely well. I think this was a great experience that we had. And thank you, Siraj Saab. Thank you, Anirudh, Ali, and Radhicka for a most engaging and insightful discussion. And above all, thank you all for joining. And we promise that we'll come back with more, especially the recommendations that have been made by Arvindji. We will come back and have a seminar or a webinar on more of those topics. COVID is here to stay, but I hope not for long. But it's here for the near, at least in the near term, and we'll keep bringing you updates on what we think the government's policy response should be. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Just a quick announcement, we'll be making the presentations that were given here available on the website, so feel free to have a look at them.
Ali wanted to say something.
No. I didn't want to.
Your hand is up, or you're waving bye-bye to everyone.
Oh, no, it's the bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Bye.